Previously, on the last days of World War II, the battle for the Rhineland. Field Marshal Montgomery's 21st Army Group has reached the Rhine. US General Omar Bradley gets there too, via Operation Lumberjack. Now they face Germany's last natural line of defense. On the Eastern Front, Stalin's Red Army continued its advance across Poland towards Berlin. And in the Pacific, US reinforcements arrived in the Philippines as the torture of thousands of POWs at the hands of the Japanese was exposed. This week, following an unexpected opportunity, the Allies make a daring charge across the Rhine. As they battle to secure the region, their sights are set on Berlin. In the Pacific, the Americans introduce unorthodox and controversial new bombing methods. The firestorms unleashed on Japan torch the capital city, the most deadly night in the history of warfare. The 4th of March. As the week begins, Operation Lumberjack is in full swing. Led by General Omar Bradley, the US 12th Army Group advances into the Rhineland. The plan. From the north, the 1st Army, under the command of Lieutenant General Hodges, will capture Cologne. From the south, Lieutenant General Patton's 3rd Army will take Koblenz, bringing the entire 12th Army Group to the banks of the Rhine. Once there, the Allies would attempt an historic and long-awaited crossing of the river.
For Germans, the Rhine was a very important cultural icon, but it also had tremendous strategic significance. This would presumably be a great strategic barrier to Allied armies trying to get into the heartland of Germany.
The 5th of March, the US 1st Army reaches the outskirts of Cologne and thrusts south towards Bonn and Remagen. The same day, Patton unleashes an assault on Germany's struggling 5th Panzer Army in a drive towards the Rhine. Moving faster than the Nazi Blitzkrieg, Patton's 3rd Army has advanced 12 miles by nightfall. In Berlin, Germany's desperation is increasingly apparent. Hitler announces the conscription of all males born in 1929. 16-year-old boys serving in the People's Army, the Volkssturm, are now sent to the front line.
By this point in the war, the only people left to fight were very young boys, 13, 14 years of age, and very old or infirm men, 60, 65 years old. So it was not a terribly effective fighting force.
The 6th of March. In just 24 hours, Cologne, already battered by Allied air raids, falls to the US 1st Army as the 3rd Army reaches the Rhine northwest of Koblenz. US troops drive into the beleaguered city. Cologne's population has dwindled from 1 million residents to only 150,000. Much of the city has been destroyed. But standing tall among the smoke and ruins is the great 13th century Gothic cathedral, which has survived largely intact.
By March of 1945, the Allied bombing campaigns had heavily damaged, if not destroyed, every major German city. There was virtually no city that was untouched. Every city of 50,000 inhabitants or more had been the target of at least one Allied bombing raid, and in the case of important cities like Frankfurt or Berlin, Cologne, the subject of multiple raids. A map of Germany at the time indicating the damage to the cities is almost covered in black. There would have been, by March of 1945, millions of people without homes, millions of people on the roads looking for shelter, looking for food, looking for some way of escaping the bombings.
To the south, Patton's armored spearhead has advanced 40 miles, taking 5,000 German prisoners along the way. As US forces push on towards the Rhine, the German army pulls back. One by one, every bridge across the Rhine is destroyed. To allow one to fall into the hands of Allied forces is punishable by death.
discipline within the German military was brutal. As they retreated back into Germany itself, they fought with even greater ferocity. This was, after all, they're fighting for their own homes, their own territory, their country. But there was no real way out.
Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower must now decide where to make the main crossing of the Rhine. Hodge's US armies in the south are not yet in position to secure the river. Across the river, the terrain is hilly and wooded, ideal for the German defenders. Strategically, Eisenhower knows the crossing should be made by Montgomery's forces. Montgomery's 21st Army Group is in position along the Rhine River opposite the vital Ruhr Valley, the industrial heart of the German war machine.
The Germans were obviously aware of Allied intentions and aware of the importance of that industrial output. The Ruhr was always heavily protected by anti-aircraft guns. It was one of the least popular targets among Allied flyers for that reason. The Germans made every effort to protect that industry, both by dispersing it, by moving some of it underground, by moving it into caves and mountains to hide it, and then to protect it.
Montgomery's planned crossing at the Ruhr would place his troops on the edge of the vast North German plain, within striking distance of Berlin. As Eisenhower orders Monty to prepare for the crossing of the Rhine, an unexpected opportunity changes everything. The 7th of March, as the 7th Corps of Hodge's 1st Army moves into Cologne, his 3rd Corps begins its final push towards the Rhine. Meanwhile, Hodge's 9th Armored Division is aiming to capture the town of Remagen on the west bank of the river, south of Bonn. It is an overcast and drizzly day, the air dank and miserable. Low cloud keeps Allied aircraft grounded. The 9th Armored Division will have no air support. But one US Army artillery spotter plane manages to take off in search of possible targets. Lieutenant Harold Larson is the pilot, accompanied by his observer, Lieutenant Frank Vaughan. 10:30 a.m. As Larson and Vaughan approach Remagen, they make a startling discovery. Through the fog, they spot a major bridge spanning the Rhine. The Ludendorff Railway Bridge, named after the German First World War general, is still standing. The official US military report of the incident would be filed 3 months later. The record states,
Lieutenant Larson said that when he passed through the area, he was amazed at the large number of AA guns which might have fired and brought him down like a clay pigeon. At approximately 10:30, when the Cub plane was about 2 to 3 miles west of the Rhine, the Ludendorff Bridge was observed to be intact. This was the first sighting of the bridge on the day it was crossed.
Larson radios the news to General Hodge, who immediately orders the troops nearest Remagen to take the bridge. Men of the 27th Armored Infantry Battalion, commanded by Lieutenant Karl Timmermann, are ordered to lead the advance. 12 p.m. Allied forces reach a cliff overlooking the Rhine. Peering into the distance, they can't believe their eyes. The Ludendorff Bridge is still intact. They soon spot German defenders retreating across the bridge. Intelligence reports say the bridge will be blown at 4 p.m., just a few hours away. Hodge issues his orders. Capture the bridge and do it quickly.
And I said, listen, we're going to run across that bridge in a few minutes. So my captain said to us, get our butts across that bridge, turn right, and fight for your life, and may God bless us all.
1 hour later, and minutes away from their deadline, US infantry approach the bridge, having faced only light resistance. They are supported by a platoon of the new Pershing tanks. The tanks attempt to knock out German machine guns and anti-aircraft guns firing from the other bank. Suddenly, as Timmermann is ordered to take his men across the bridge, there are 2 enormous explosions. One from a demolition charge at the western end, and one 2/3 of the way across. The bridge still stands. Timmermann wastes no time. Under heavy artillery fire, he and his platoon charge across the bridge.
We ran across that damn bridge so fast. And as we was running across the bridge, I'll never forget, the German dropped a bomb and it shook the bridge. There was a big hole in the bridge. We had to jump over the bridge. Otherwise, you'd landed in the Rhine River. And we ran across the bridge and we turned right and we fought. I'll never forget running across that bridge.
As they charge, a squad of US Army engineers cut any wires that might be leading to demolition charges. Approximately 1,000 pounds of explosives are dropped into the river. Sergeant Alex Drabik races past the towers and is the first Allied soldier to cross the Rhine. Sergeant Joe Delisio reaches the right-hand tower and silences a German machine gun squad. The Germans launch planes, including some of the first jet bombers, in an attempt to destroy the bridge, but the attacks are unsuccessful. The 27th Armoured Infantry Battalion's gallant dash across the Rhine allows the Allies to establish a crucial bridgehead. A few days later, Lieutenant Colonel Engerman and Lieutenant Grimble tell the story of the bridge's capture.
On March the 7th, at about noon, with Lieutenant Grimble as my advance guard commander, my column came to the hill there, which commands a view of this whole valley. I formulated a plan to come into the town and reach the approach to the bridge. The tanks immediately took position and began firing across at the Germans who were on the bridge. In a few minutes, 2 detonations occurred on the bridge. And if the bridge was still in one piece, the infantry then started moving across. It was about 3:30 at that time.
The tanks covered the towers and fired on them. The Germans jumped from the tops of the towers to the bridge. They ran back across the bridge, and our infantry pursued them.
And that's all there was to it.
News that a Rhine bridge has been captured soon reaches Eisenhower. He instructs the 12th Army Group Commander, Omar Bradley, to push as many men across the Rhine as he can. Anti-aircraft guns are set up around the bridge. Fighters patrol overhead.
These planes started flying over. It was virtually a blackout of the sun. There were so many airplanes. We had such power of the skies that it was comforting for us on the ground to know that these fellows are up there doing their job.
Allied engineers work desperately to repair the planking over the railway lines so that tanks and other vehicles can cross. By nightfall, 600 Americans are on the Rhine's east bank.
In the middle, we give them a box of cigars and some bottles of champagne and say, "Welcome to Germany."
The 8th of March. Shortly after midnight, Colonel Engerman's tanks are poised for the final push into Germany. March 1945. Nearly 11 million people are on the move in Germany. Most are attempting to flee as the Allies advance.
Virtually every German soldier was at some point taken prisoner. There were millions held prisoner in the Soviet Union. People had anxieties about them. There were so many refugees on the road. People had concerns about where their members of their family were. They had concerns for their own daily survival.
The citizens in the major cities of Germany had already evacuated women and children out of the cities. Most of the major cities had been attacked and really were reduced to rubble by the spring of 1945.
Others, despite the chaos and destruction, are hoping to find their way back to the ravaged city of Berlin. The 7th of March. Among those who return is Eva Braun, Hitler's long-term mistress. She leaves her retreat in the Bavarian Alps to join the Führer, who refuses to leave the embattled German capital.
There was a lot of talk about getting out of Berlin. It was clear the Russians were coming, that Berlin would be cut off. All the military people could see this. So there was a good deal of pressure exerted on Hitler by his military leaders as well as party leaders to leave Berlin and to go to Berchtesgaden, to the Obersalzberg, this area where there were more bunkers in the mountains, the Alps, where a last stand could be made, who knows for how long.
News of the Allied bridgehead across the Rhine makes its way to Berlin. Hitler is alarmed and furious.
Nobody was saying Heil Hitler anymore as a greeting. They were supposed to. No, very few people ever did anymore. Instead, in Berlin, when one said, instead of saying Auf Wiedersehen, goodbye, they would say Bleib übrig, which means survive.
Hitler immediately fires the commander-in-chief of the West, Field Marshal von Rundstedt, along with 4 other generals. For several days, German troops in the West will be without a leader. March the 8th, the next day at Remagen, despite constant shelling by German defenses, more than 8,000 US troops and 50 armored vehicles crossed the Ludendorff Bridge.
Once we made it across the bridge, we were greeted by Colonel Jeter, and he gave us a welcome speech, and he told us, now that you're going up on line, you have to take off those overcoats and those galoshes. And I asked him why. He said, because they tend to hold you back. Says you don't need nothing to hold you back. We're into Germany now, and we're here to stay.
The Germans throw all the forces they can muster against the bridgehead.
The German planes were trying to knock out the bridge and whatnot. They'd have their dogfights over top of our foxholes, and sometimes the spent shells would be coming down all around us. So we used to say, go fight someplace else. You know what I mean? We have enough problems here on the ground.
The remnants of 3 German armored divisions move in, but their reactions are slowed by confusion in the chain of command, relentless US artillery fire, and a severe shortage of fuel.
Fuel was a real bottleneck in the German military supply system. Germany effectively doesn't have any of its own native supplies of petroleum, so it was forced to import whatever it could get. Given all of the blunders and the material shortages and so forth, the German defeat in the spring of 1945, while purchased at high cost in the previous years, was beginning to look inevitable.
An additional 1,400 pounds of explosives are removed from wells in the bridge piers. One engineer described the work.
Started working back this way, and we found one main charge, about 500 pounds that hadn't been detonated. We neutralized that and worked on this way. We came to the pier. The pier had 2 big separate wells in it, filled with explosive. We cut the wires to that because they were too heavy to lift out.
Word of the Remagen bridge crossing also reaches Joseph Stalin in Moscow. He grows anxious over the race to Berlin. The 8th of March, Moscow. After receiving word of the American Rhine crossing, Stalin is determined that the Red Army will take Berlin. He summons his top commander, General Zhukov, back to Moscow. He is ordered to review the planning of their Berlin operation.
The other commander was Konev, another prominent and successful Russian commander. And the real race to Berlin is not between American allied armies and the Soviets, but between these 2 Soviet generals for the honor of capturing the German capital first. And Stalin intentionally cultivated a rivalry between the 2 for this honor, and essentially said whoever can get there first wins the glory.
The 9th of March, Remagen. As the Germans continue their defense, landing craft manned by US Navy personnel arrive to help secure the bridgehead. 11 a.m. US engineers begin operating the first of 3 ferries that will cross the Rhine. Then they undertake the enormous task of building footbridges, a treadway bridge and a pontoon bridge.
There's a major river that flows north-south in Europe about every 50 miles. And getting across these things is a major engineering operation. There's a couple of ways you can do that. One is to use the existing bridges that are there. The problem is, the other guy is smart, he blows them. So that means then the good old engineers have to build you a bridge.
The Rhine crossings will test the Allied engineering corps to the limit.
The bridgehead in World War II terms is both sides of the river. So they had to be prepared. You had to make it so that vehicles could get into these bridgehead areas easily and get out of them once they got across the river. Not an easy task. Not an easy task at all. It sounds easy, but when you're doing this under fire, it's pretty difficult to do.
7,000 servicemen will be involved in the massive bridge-building operations at Remagen, across 1,500 feet of fast-flowing river. Supplies are regularly hauled in from Toul in France, a 300-mile round-trip journey. The pontoon bridge is made from 12-foot floating rubber sections called treadways. They are assembled quickly offshore, then transported to the river by cranes and cables. Most of the construction is done rapidly and under the constant threat of enemy fire. 35 soldiers are killed by snipers, yet the bridge is still completed in 32 hours.
Across those pontoons, they had 2 metal beams, and they could be connected together so they could form at any length. And you could set them the length of a tank track and literally drive a tank across the treadway pontoon bridge. Really a marvel of engineering.
The pontoon bridge at Remagen is the longest bridge built under fire by the US engineers in World War II. By the end of the war, Allied engineers have built 67 bridges across the Rhine, allowing 60,000 army vehicles and countless Allied troops to participate in the final push against Germany. The 9th of March. The Germans are now desperate to destroy the bridge they left standing in their hasty retreat. The Luftwaffe attacks the bridge using Me-262 jets and dive bombers. They are met by a wall of anti-aircraft fire. To halt the Allied advance, the Germans also employ a massive 170mm railway gun, and in desperation fire V-2 missiles against the bridge. In Berlin, a raging Hitler orders a court-martial to apportion blame for the Remagen bridge capture. His campaign to eliminate defeatism and incompetence amongst his own officers extends to the Luftwaffe and the Kriegsmarine. Over the next week, 5 junior officers who had been in command around Remagen are court-martialed. 4 others are executed immediately. The 10th of March. Hitler replaces Rundstedt with Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, nicknamed Smiling Albert. But now 4 Allied divisions are holding the Remagen bridgehead. In the chaos and euphoria, one sobering fact is overlooked. The bridge is not where the Allied forces need to cross the Rhine. It is isolated at the end of a narrow corridor. If they were to push forward from Remagen into the hilly countryside, they risk being cut off. Eisenhower tells Hodges to continue to send his forces across the river, but not to advance. The main Allied crossing would still be made by the British north of the Ruhr. In Berlin, the 6th of March. Against the advice of his generals, Hitler launches his last offensive in a bid to rescue the vital oil fields of Hungary. Its code name is Frühlingsverwachen, Spring Awakening. Ironically, the spring thaw has transformed the landscape to mud. Despite constant air attacks, Hitler has transported his once mighty 6th Panzer Army across Europe and repositioned it north of Lake Balaton. Under the command of his loyal old warrior, General Joseph Sepp Dietrich, they strike east towards the Danube, while the 2nd Panzer Army advances south to the lake, hoping to trap the Soviets in a pincer. Dietrich was an SS soldier to the core, greatly admired by Hitler. As part of the Führer's inner circle, he accompanied Hitler on many trips and events and was a regular visitor to Hitler's retreat in the Bavarian Alps. When he had joined the Nazi Party in 1928, Dietrich was already a decorated soldier. He was soon given command of the Führer's personal bodyguard. In 1934, he had been made SS Obergruppenführer, equivalent to an army general. When war broke out, he earned a reputation as an able commander in France and Russia. By June 1944, Dietrich was commanding 3 divisions of the 1st Panzer Corps. Hitler promoted him further, putting him in charge of the powerful 6th Panzer Army, which he led in the failed Ardennes offensive. Although a deeply committed SS general, Dietrich did not agree with the most extreme Nazi policies. Twice he had protested directly to the Führer about the murdering of Jews. Nevertheless, Hitler never lost faith in Sepp Dietrich, although Dietrich would finally become disillusioned with his Führer's defense of Germany. Now, at Lake Balaton, Dietrich faces impossible obstacles: mud, fuel shortages, fierce Russian opposition. Within 10 days, the offensive grinds to a halt. The oil fields are lost. In 3 weeks, the overwhelming advance of the Red Army would take them within 5 miles of Vienna, where Dietrich's last battle will be fought. But the Nazis are still capable of appalling atrocities in the occupied areas that the Allies have yet to reach. In March 1945, most of the Netherlands is still under Nazi occupation. German troops had invaded in 1940, after which the country was governed by an SS Reich Commissioner. Panic-stricken Jews had attempted to escape the country. Some made their way southward through France to eventually find sanctuary in Spain, Portugal, or Switzerland. 200 others were evacuated to Britain. The 6th of March 1945. Dutch civilians had endured their harshest winter of the war, with little food or fuel. Starvation is a constant threat. Nevertheless, the resistance movement is fierce. Dutch fighters plan to hijack a German vehicle taking food and supplies to an SS base. In the dark of night, a BMW convertible is stopped by men dressed in German uniforms. Suspecting a trap, the car keeps moving, but is stopped by machine gun fire. The driver and rear seat passenger are killed. The passenger in the front seat is wounded, but alive. He is none other than General Hans Rauter, the head of Nazi security and police in the Netherlands. For nearly 5 years, Rauter has terrorized the Dutch people and overseen the deportation of Dutch Jews. Following the ambush, German troops discover the damaged car. Rauter is taken to a hospital and treated for his injuries. The Nazis assume the botched robbery is an assassination attempt. Rauter's deputy orders immediate reprisals. The 8th of March, 116 men are rounded up and transported to the ambush scene. They are all shot dead, then buried in a mass grave. In Gestapo prisons all over the Netherlands, prisoners are taken out and shot. By the end of the Nazi retaliation, 262 people have been killed, amongst the most notorious war crimes ever committed in the Netherlands. Coming up, the Nazi regime is cornered by the looming Allied advance.
The Nazis understood the war was lost, and so the regime ratcheted up the system of terror.
And in the skies over Japan, a wave of B-29s brings fire and death to the capital.
I think that plane helped win the war. They couldn't win on the ground. They had to win it in the air.
The 9th of March, 1945. In a night raid, 325 B-29s packed with incendiaries approach Tokyo. Over the past 3 years, the Japanese military has failed to anticipate America's build-up of military air power. They have concentrated on sea power and ignored the warning given by the Doolittle raid of 1942 that the imperial homeland is not invulnerable. Boeing's B-29 is the most advanced bomber of World War II.
The Japanese never had anything that would even compare with the B-29.
Powered by 4 radial engines, it's the first US bomber fitted with radar. Its fully pressurized crew compartments allow the aircraft to reach 40,000 feet.
You didn't have that on any other plane. The idea was to be able to have comfort and be able to get to high altitude without everybody wearing gas masks. And the radar was something the B-17s didn't have, and it made all the difference in the world.
Armed with 1 cannon and 10 machine guns, it is the first plane to operate its guns by remote control. By mid-1944, sufficient B-29s were available to set up 2 bomber commands, the 20th in India and China, and the 21st on the Marianas Islands of Saipan, Tinian and Guam. On the 24th of November 1944, a force of 111 B-29s from Saipan launched their first raid on Tokyo. They used the same high-level daylight tactics used in Europe and quickly encounter similar problems. Radar targeting proves less precise than expected. Few bombs drop anywhere near their target, the Nakajima Aircraft Engine Factory, which made 1/3 of all the engines needed by Japan's armed forces. Production at the plant continues virtually unaffected. The bombers are operating at such high altitudes that they are severely affected by the jet stream.
A jet stream is very high velocity winds at altitude. It whips snow like a snake. One of the bombardiers missed the target by 2 miles because they were being blown higher velocity than what they had anticipated.
Anti-aircraft defenses, fighters, and dangerous flying conditions take their toll. The 21st Bomber Command is losing more bombers and aircrew than it can sustain. At this rate, the average crew could expect to die within 16 missions. As American morale plunges, US General Curtis LeMay orders a radical change in tactics. The 9th of March 1945, 325 B-29 bombers take off as night falls on the Marianas Islands. Their target, Tokyo. American forces on Iwo Jima, just 750 miles from Tokyo, have nearly secured the island. This means Japanese radar stations on the island can no longer give early warning of the bomber raids. LeMay sends his B-29s at low altitude to avoid the jet stream, using Allied radar as their guide. His planes should be safe flying under cover of night.
Under the cloak of darkness, you don't have to go high. You can come in at 5,000 feet under the clouds. You can come in under the jet stream. You don't need all that defensive armament. So your planes are lighter, they're not fighting the winds, you don't need as much fuel. You can increase your bomb load from 2 to 3 tons to 6 tons. And also, instead of using high explosive bombs and trying to hit precise targets, he goes to area bombing. He's going to drop incendiaries. He's not worrying about hitting a precise factory. He's going to drop fire bombs in the neighborhood, burn down the entire neighborhood. The factory burns too.
LeMay knows that Japanese cities are made primarily of paper and wood, that they will burn quickly and wildly. This will prove deadly for the civilian population.
The Japanese radar was not all that good, and their night fighters were practically non-existent. So they got away with it, and it worked, and it was a devastating tactic.
The 10th of March 1945, shortly after midnight, B-29s dropped more than 1,500 tons of incendiaries on Tokyo. 16 square miles of the city are transformed into a raging inferno. A column of superheated air makes conditions unstable for pilots.
You had huge numbers of planes, and you would have some go in ahead of others. So the initial guys that went in, they didn't see any fires. But those that followed would be going through a firestorm. In fact, these updrafts made it like flying into a tornado or something. And massive areas would be in flames, particularly for the trailing aircraft.
On the ground, the fires consume everything and everyone in their path. In the first 6 hours of the firestorm, nearly 83,000 Japanese civilians are killed and 250,000 buildings destroyed.
They injured 40,000, they left 1 million homeless. It was the deadliest single air raid of World War II. This was strategic bombing with a vengeance.
You're dropping your bombs, you're on target, and you're just concerned about accuracy, doing what you were sent to do.
2 survivors, Yoshiko Hashimoto and Isukio Taki, described the horrors of that night.
Before the night of March 10th, the air raids were not so bad. I remember the night of March 10th. It was very windy. While we were in the shelter, it became noisy outside. When I came out, I saw the sky in the west was completely red.
My aunt was hiding from the wind, with my little sister on her back. Suddenly, my aunt felt lighter. My sister had come off her back. She had become a fireball. Before the little girl fell to the ground, she was swept up in the wind.
The 10th of March 1945, 5 a.m. In Tokyo, the firestorm has ended and the all clear is sounded. But it will take months to clear the rubble and remove the dead. The raid has achieved its objective. The massive civilian casualties shatter Japanese morale. But honor will not permit surrender.
Honor was a very important concept to the Japanese soldier. It was as important as it was to his enemy, except that for him, honor meant if you have to sacrifice your life, you do that willingly. In fact, either you win or you die.
The Japanese emperor insists on viewing the damage. He is appalled by what he sees, but will not order surrender.
There was this feeling that if they would just quit, they've lost the war, why do they keep fighting? And that was a kind of an emotional feeling. You know, you don't like to drop bombs on people. It's like fighting somebody and they're hitting them after they're already down. So there was this conviction that Japan had lost the war, and they knew they had lost the war. And I think that's true, except the Japanese military code didn't have a way to quit.
The war against Japan will continue. In Washington, the projected number of US casualties that would result from a ground invasion of Japan is 100,000. That number is revised daily. Soon, it will be nearer 200,000. The prospect of unprecedented loss of American life is
going to be developed in time, or if there would be enough bombs to terrify Japan into surrender. Then there was no guarantee the Japanese were going to quit, because past experience had shown that a lot of Japanese were willing to die rather than admit defeat.
We get letters and posters and things all the time that says that the Secretary of War assures us that this is the most important project going on in the war, period.
But no one, not even the scientists themselves, are sure it's going to work.
The physicists discovered the Dragon, but the engineers had to harness the Dragon and make him work.
The highly classified research continues under rigid security. As the bloody conflict in the Pacific drags on, as the Nazis grow increasingly desperate, and as the US and Britain begin to eye Stalin with increasing suspicion, the bomb is seen not only as a means to end the war, but as a way to ensure peace. Next, on the last days of World War II, the B-29 raids on Japan continue. The residents of Tokyo learn to live in fear.
There's this idea that the Japanese people have to be steadfast, faithful to the emperor, and that somehow their courage will save Japan. Not all Japanese people are buying that anymore.
Inside the Reich, desperation drives Nazi leaders to extremes.
The last 2 months of the Nazi regime are bizarre beyond belief.
As Germany crumbles, they will try to hide their atrocities.
The death camps, which were in the east, like Treblinka and Sobibor, there wouldn't have been anything to see except piles of ash.
And Anne Frank, whose diary came to symbolize the suffering under the Nazi regime, dies of typhus inside a concentration camp.